which is not as good a move as the bishop takes knight was, because black still hasn't solved his problem of getting the queen knight out. So now in this position, with the moves order reversed, how can black stop the checkmate? Well, it turns out that black has only one legal move to prevent the checkmate, and that's to play bishop to e2. So already we can see this is looking better than that other line, because in the other line, when he moved his bishop to e2, he got my knight with it, but in this line, he doesn't get anything. So I just go rook takes bishop. And now, of course, he plays knight to a6, and that defends the checkmate at e8. All right, now you might still wonder, so what has white accomplished by doing this different move order? Because we kind of have a similar material, exactly the same material count as in the game. But here there's a big difference. Okay, the difference is that knight on d4. What that knight does is, of course, it can't stay there for long, but just by being there for one move, it cuts black's bishop off from the defense of his king. So white now has the very powerful move, rook to f2 check. And black cannot bring his bishop back to f6 to defend. So his only move is to go king to g8. And now white plays knight to f5 with very, very powerful threats. So the knight here is much better placed than the knight that I had in the game. Remember, in the game, my knight ended up going to e4, where it had no threats. But here the knight is on f5 and threatens a very big check with knight to e7 check. So let's look at a few variations. White is actually winning by force here, and it's kind of amazing. So for example, let's look at a relatively bad move, rook to f8. Well, that would lose right away, because white goes knight to e2, e7 check, king is forced to h8, and then white goes rook to f8, it takes f8 checkmate. So we can see that one point of this variation is that white is forcing black's king into the corner, and the king finds himself in a mating net there. Okay, now you might say, okay, well, that rook move was kind of a bad move because it's putting the rook right where it could be taken. So let's look for a better move. Suppose black plays knight to c5. That seems like a decent move. It's activating the knight, threatening the pawn on a4, but it also doesn't work. White still plays knight to e7. Again, black is forced into the corner, and again, his king is in a mating net. It's got no squares. And so all white has to do is play rook to f3. And now we see the checkmate not along the back rank, but along the h-file, which has been opened up because of that pawn capture, the pawn on h6 taking my knight on g5. And so how does black defend the checkmate? He's only got one way, which is to play g4, but then I just play rook to f5, threatening checkmate again. Again, black has only one way to defend. That's bishop to c1, so that he can interpose his bishop on h6 after rook to h5 check. But then white simply grabs the knight on c5, and white is a piece up with the one game. Let's look at a couple more lines, because it's just really neat, all the different combinations here. So you might say, okay, well, knight c5 wasn't a very great move, because that also kind of put a piece where white could take it. So let's try to find a better move. Well, one thing you might think is, okay, black's problem is his king is getting chased to the corner. So why don't we move it back towards the center where it's a little bit safer and play king to f8? Then white will play knight to e7, discovered check, and black has only one move, bishop to f6. But, you know, this is looking somewhat promising for black, because he's now getting the bishop into the defense. Unfortunately, once again, black is in a mating net. White again plays rook to f3. And believe it or not, black can't do anything, because white is now threatening to go rook to h3, and again, rook to h8, with a checkmate on the back rank. If black plays g4, which is really his only defense, then I go rook to f5, once again, setting up the same threat. So really beautiful idea here. And you know, if black tries to, you know, play a waiting move or something like that, you know, just move the rook, then rook over, and even bishop takes knight doesn't get black out of trouble because rook to h8 is still checkmate. So there's one more line that may be worth looking at, which I really doubt that anyone would have come up with, any human, but the computer comes up with this, which is to play g4, which actually anticipates white's rook threat. But even on this, white comes out with a very big advantage, probably winning advantage. Okay, after bishop c8, now again this stops the checkmate, but white can simply go rook takes pawn, winning a pawn. And now the threat of bishop to d3 is just lethal, winning a piece. So black cannot survive in this position either. So going back to the original position, we can see that white missed, that I missed a really beautiful combination. I mean, this would have been not only a win, but a wonderful win. And it's all because I didn't appreciate the importance of the move order, that playing knight to d4 first, followed by bishop to g6, was more effective than playing bishop to g6, followed by knight to d4. So little subtleties of move order can make a huge difference. Okay, here's my second example of a position where I needed to reverse the move order. This is a game that I played in 2003 against a player named Nikolai Andrianov, roughly 2400 player. And again, let's look at this position. So basically, white has given up two pieces for a rook, but I do have a very strong kingside attack. I've sort of flushed black's king out into the open. And now I play queen takes pawn check, which forces bishop to g7. And so now the question is, how does white proceed with the attack? Now here again, I moved too impulsively and didn't think about reversing the move order. The move I played was rook takes pawn check. Now I have to admit that I had been lusting after this move for several moves in this game. I've just been waiting for the right opportunity to play it. So, big bold rook sacrifice. But as it turns out, it doesn't quite work. So here's what happened. My opponent played pawn takes rook. I go queen takes pawn check. He goes king g8. And now I played knight d5. And of course, this is the point of my rook sacrifice, this knight d5 move, because white is now threatening the queen, also threatening knight to e2 check, which would set up a mating net, very similar to our last game, by the way. And if black goes bishop takes knight, then I go queen takes bishop check, forking the king and rook. So after king to h7, I go queen takes rook. And now, after, say, something like bishop takes pawn, I now have a rook and two pieces for the bishop and knight. Plus, I have just a killing attack because his king is completely wide open. And I could do something like, say, queen to f8, threatening rook to e7 check, and this game is just going to be over pretty soon. So in my analysis, I saw all of this, and I saw knight to d5 coming, and I was just so excited. I thought, I'm winning this game by force. I'm beating a 2400 player, which is pretty good for me. So unfortunately, as in the last position, I failed to take into account all of my opponent's possible replies. In fact, black has one good move here, which is to play rook to f8, and that's what Andrianov played. And here, white can win back his rook, which is nice. Queen takes rook check, king takes queen, and knight takes queen. So white's recovered the sacrificed rook. But after bishop takes pawn, we now have a vastly different position from the previous one that we looked at, because the queens are off the board. And with queens off the board, white no longer has the kind of overwhelming attack that he did in the other variation. And in fact, here I played knight to e6 check. He went knight takes knight. I played rook takes knight. And black won this game in pretty short order, because the two bishops are just much, much more powerful than a rook. And even though I have connected passed pawns on the king side, they're just way too slow to really make any difference. All right, so basically, after the game, I just chalked it up to, well, my sacrifice wasn't quite good enough. But then when I went over the game later with the computer showed me what I did wrong. And again, it's a matter of just reversing the move order. So we see that white's idea in the previous line was rook takes pawn check, followed by knight to d5. So why not reverse those two moves? Why not go, instead of rook takes pawn check, go knight to d5 first? Well, this is a move that never even occurred to me. And the reason it didn't occur to me was that I was so focused on sacrificing my rook. I was almost hypnotized by that move. And also, knight to d5, it looks like I'm just sticking the knight out there for no reason. Just hanging the knight. What's the point? But of course the point is that by playing this move first, I'm forcing black to go into a better line for me. I'm taking away that rook to f8 defense that he had in the other variation. So in this variation, black will have to play bishop takes knight. And now I play my rook sacrifice, my beautiful rook sacrifice. And now everything works like butter. Queen takes pawn check, king to g8, forced, queen takes bishop check, and I get my fork of the king and rook, and I have a winning position, as we saw earlier. So once again, I was on the threshold of a beautiful combination, but I just didn't think about reversing the move order. Okay, now let's look at one more example of reversing the move order. This came from my most recent tournament, the National Open in Las Vegas in June of 2007. So in this game, I'm white once again, and my opponent is Eugene Yanite, who's a FIDE master, rated, I believe, in the 2300s, maybe even the 2400s. And we're looking at the position after I've played my 23rd move, which was queen to d2.